In St. Mary's emergency room, a poor dad thought he was about to lose everything until a wealthy widow touched his shoulder and changed all their lives forever. Comment what you would do in his place, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. In the harsh fluorescent glow of St. Mary's emergency room, Daniel Alvarez sat hunched over in a plastic chair, his work shirt still damp with his daughter's blood. His rough hands, blistered from years of swinging hammers and lifting beams, shook as he tried dialing Isabella one more time. Straight to voicemail, just like the last dozen attempts. He whispered her name, his voice breaking, as if saying it softer might make her answer. But San Diego was far away, and so was the woman who had walked out of their lives years ago. The surgeon's tone was steady but urgent. "Mr. Alvarez, we can't proceed without consent from both legal guardians. It has to be your ex-wife." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to scream that Lily was his world, that he had been the one to braid her hair, cook her meals, sit through every piano lesson. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. On paper, Isabella still had a say, and without her signature, the little girl on the operating table was slipping further from his grasp. He buried his face in his palms, the salt of his tears mixing with the grit of concrete dust still clinging to his skin. Around him, nurses rushed by with charts and gurneys, parents clutched crying children, and monitors beeped in mechanical indifference. But to Daniel, the world had shrunk to silence, broken only by the echo of his daughter's voice in memory. "Daddy, am I good enough?" The weight of helplessness pressed on him until he could hardly breathe. He thought of Lily's laughter filling their small apartment, her fingers finding shy melodies on the piano, the way she called him her hero, even when he felt anything but. And now red tape stood between him and saving her life. He felt powerless, stripped of every ounce of strength he had built over years of sacrifice. Then, through the blur of his grief, a hand touched his shoulder, light, deliberate, with a calmness that cut through the chaos. He lifted his head to see a woman unlike anyone he expected in this place. Blonde hair perfectly gathered, a black coat that looked like it belonged in another world, a diamond ring catching the light. She did not look down at him with pity, but with something quieter, something he couldn't name. "I know that feeling," she said, her voice low, steady, sitting in a hospital, desperate for someone to show up, and no one does. Her words slipped into the cracks of his heart where loneliness had been hiding for years. He blinked at her, unable to speak, unable to understand why this stranger would sit beside him. Charlotte Whitmore didn't move away. Instead, she leaned closer, her tone soft but certain. "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time that night, Daniel felt the smallest flicker of hope. Charlotte sat beside him, her eyes following the rhythm of his trembling hands. For a moment, she wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was back in Denver, in another sterile waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. She could still feel the cold pen in her fingers as she signed the papers that would turn her husband's organs into lifelines for strangers. David had slipped away while she sat alone in a chair much like this one, praying for a miracle that never came. No one had touched her shoulder. No one had told her she wasn't alone. Looking at Daniel now, his shirt streaked with blood, his eyes hollowed by despair, Charlotte felt the sharp sting of recognition. Pain, after all, has no language of wealth or class. It is the one currency that makes strangers kin. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, the polished case gleaming under the harsh hospital lights. "Henry," she whispered when her attorney picked up, "I need you at St. Mary's right now. A little girl's life depends on it." On the other end of the line, Henry Cole did not hesitate. He had handled Charlotte's affairs for years, from foundation grants to estate matters, but he had never heard her voice like this. Urgent, breaking, alive with something that wasn't business. She explained the situation quickly. A father trapped by legal red tape, an absent mother unreachable, a child bleeding behind closed doors. Henry promised to make calls, to push through paperwork, to find a judge if he had to. Daniel watched her, his brows furrowed with suspicion, as though he couldn't quite accept that someone dressed in silk and diamonds would care about a construction worker's child. He opened his mouth to speak, but Charlotte shook her head gently, silencing him. "Save your strength for her," she said, her gaze steady. "Let me handle this." And so while Daniel sat with his face buried in his hands, Charlotte paced the hallway, her voice calm but commanding as she spoke to Henry, to the hospital administration, to anyone who would listen. Her presence seemed to shift the air itself, turning obstacles into possibilities. For the first time in hours, Daniel felt the ground beneath him steady. A nurse approached with a clipboard. Her expression changed. "We've received authorization. The surgery can proceed." Daniel exhaled so sharply it was almost a sob, his knees just weakening. But Charlotte's hand was there again, grounding him. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the disbelief. He turned to her, words tangled in his throat. "Why? Why would you do this for us?" Charlotte looked at him, her eyes reflecting the weight of her own memories. "Because once I needed someone to do it for me, and no one came." Her voice caught, but she steadied herself quickly, not wanting pity, only truth. "I couldn't save David, but maybe, just maybe, I can help you save Lily." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a thread woven from grief and courage, from loss and the faintest spark of hope. Two worlds had collided in the most unlikely of places, a penthouse widow and a construction worker, bound by nothing but the raw, unvarnished ache of love for someone they couldn't bear to lose. Daniel lowered his head, unable to trust his voice, but he didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. And as the doors to the operating room swung open, Charlotte stayed by his side. No longer a stranger, but something more. A witness, an anchor, perhaps even the first fragile sign that he wasn't as alone in this fight as he had always believed. Long before the crash, before the desperate night at St. Mary's, Daniel Alvarez's life had already been shaped by sacrifice. He was 34, a construction worker whose days began before dawn, when the rest of the city still slept. The alarm would sound at 5, and he would rise quietly in their modest apartment on the edge of Chicago, careful not to wake Lily until breakfast was ready. The kitchen smelled of scrambled eggs or pancakes most mornings, sometimes just toast and fruit, but always made with the kind of care that told a little girl she mattered more than anything else in the world. When Isabella had walked away 2 years earlier, she left nothing but a note and a frightened child crying on her bed. Addiction had taken her down a road Daniel could not follow, no matter how much he wished Lily could still have a mother. That night, when his daughter asked through her tears, "Am I not good enough for her to stay, Daddy?" his heart cracked in a way that had never fully healed. From that moment forward, Daniel made himself a promise. He would love Lily enough for two parents. He would never let her question her worth again. Every afternoon after work, Daniel scrubbed off the grit and dust of the construction site in a gas station restroom before heading to the community music center. There he sat on an old wooden bench, posture straight, hands folded, while Lily's small fingers coaxed halting melodies from the piano keys. Other parents scrolled through phones or checked watches, but Daniel never took his eyes off her. Each note was a victory, each shy smile a reminder of why every overtime shift was worth it. Back home, evenings belonged to them. Sometimes it was helping with math homework at the kitchen table, sometimes patching a rip in her school uniform with clumsy stitches. Always it ended with a story. Daniel would sit at the edge of her bed, reading tales in a mix of English and Spanish, his voice soft even when exhaustion threatened to drag him under. Lily would giggle when he gave characters silly accents, and on the hardest days, that sound was the only thing keeping him going. Neighbors whispered admiration for the young father, who seemed to have aged a decade in 2 years. His hands were calloused, his back often sore, but his devotion never wavered. Friends at the job site teased him about never dating, pointing out the widow from the first floor who always seemed to invent excuses for Daniel to stop by. He only smiled politely and shook his head. "Lily needs me," he would say, though deep in the high void it was more than that. His heart bore scars, and he had no room left for risks that might hurt her again. Yet, even in the weariness, Daniel carried himself with quiet pride. He wasn't rich, wasn't polished, but when Lily looked at him with those wide eyes, full of trust and adoration, he felt like the luckiest man alive. She was his reason for every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice. And though the world often dismissed him as just another laborer in a hard hat, to Lily he was everything, her protector, her teacher, her best friend. That was the man Charlotte Whitmore had found in the hospital waiting room, broken and desperate, but still fighting. And as fate would have it, the same love that had carried him this far was about to change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. After the surgery, when the tension finally gave way to relief, Daniel thought Charlotte Whitmore would simply disappear back into her world of penthouses and polished boardrooms. People like her didn't linger in places like his, but she came back the very next morning, a soft smile on her face, carrying a stuffed bear almost as big as Lily and a stack of children's books tucked neatly under her arm. She didn't arrive with the air of a benefactor. She came like someone who truly wanted to know how a little girl was healing. Lily's eyes lit up when Charlotte entered her hospital room. She clutched the bear against her chest as if it had been waiting for her all along. Charlotte pulled a chair close to the bed and began reading in a gentle voice that filled the sterile room with warmth. When Daniel excused himself to grab coffee or talk with the doctors, he would return to the sound of quiet laughter. Charlotte leaning in as Lily pointed at pictures, her face alive with joy. When Lily was finally discharged, Daniel expected the connection to fade, but it didn't. Charlotte texted to check in, sometimes just a few words. How was she feeling today? Did she smile? Sometimes long enough to feel like a conversation. She called on video in the evenings, praising Lily's drawings, reminding her to do her stretches for physical therapy. And when Daniel's overtime shift made it impossible to take Lily to her first piano lesson after the accident, Charlotte volunteered without hesitation. He wanted to refuse, pride prickling, but Lily's hopeful face softened his resistance. That evening, when Daniel came home exhausted from the sight, he opened the door to a smell he hadn't encountered in years, sweet, warm, like a memory of childhood. He froze at the doorway to the kitchen. There, flour dusted across the counter like snow. Lily stood on a chair in an apron far too big for her, cheeks smudged with dough. Beside her was Charlotte, sleeves rolled up, a matching apron tied neatly, guiding Lily's small hands as they pressed cookie cutters into the dough. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. The scene was so ordinary, yet so foreign to his world. The sight of his daughter laughing carefree with another adult who cared enough to be there. It caught him off guard. He leaned against the doorframe, silent, watching the two of them giggle over a misshapen cookie that looked more like a cloud than a star. Charlotte noticed him finally, her cheeks coloring with embarrassment. We decided to bake to celebrate her lesson, she said softly, brushing flour from her fingers. Sorry about the mess. Daniel shook his head, his throat tight. It's fine, he managed, though his voice cracked. What he wanted to say was, thank you for the cookies, for the laughter, for making our kitchen feel like a home again. Lily beamed, holding up the tray of uneven shapes. Daddy, we're making dessert. Charlotte says I'm a natural. He smiled, though his eyes burned. It had been a long time since anyone besides him had stood in that kitchen with Lily. Longer still since he had seen his daughter's world feel so full. And as Charlotte laughed, with flowers still on her cheek, Daniel realized something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope that maybe, just maybe, their lives didn't have to stay so small. A week later, Charlotte surprised them with an invitation. Why don't you come over for dinner? She asked gently, as if aware of how unusual the question sounded. Daniel hesitated, but Lily's eyes widened with excitement. And so, on a cool Friday evening, he found himself standing with his daughter at the entrance of a high-rise penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The doorman greeted Charlotte by name as she ushered them inside. The moment Daniel stepped through the glass doors, he felt the weight of the space press against him. Marble floors reflected the glow of recessed lighting, and walls of glass stretched to the ceiling, framing the shimmering expanse of the lake. It was breathtaking, yet it felt cold, too perfect, as if no child's laughter had ever echoed against these walls. Lily darted to the window, pressing her small hands against the glass. Daddy, look, you can see all the boats. Her voice carried across the cavernous room. But Daniel stood awkwardly by the door, tugging at the cuff of his work jacket. He didn't belong here, not with his calloused hands and boots still dusty from the job site. Charlotte seemed to sense his unease. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. Beautiful view, isn't it? She said, her smile warm but tinged with something else. But it doesn't feel like home. Her honesty startled him. He looked at her, then at the polished surfaces and carefully curated artwork. He thought of his tiny apartment, cluttered with Lily's drawings taped to the fridge, her piano book stacked on the counter, the faint smell of tortillas and laundry soap filling the air. That was home. This was something else. Later, when Lily had fallen asleep in the guest room, Charlotte led Daniel onto the balcony. The city stretched before them, a sea of lights flickering against the night sky, the lake dark and endless beyond. The wind off the water carried a chill, but Daniel barely noticed. He leaned on the railing, eyes on the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, he spoke the truth he usually kept buried. Isabella left because she said I wasn't enough, he said quietly. Not enough money, not enough patience, not enough of anything. And maybe she was right. I work with my hands. I come home covered in dust. I don't have much to give Lily except me. And I worry every day that even that isn't enough. His voice wavered, the vulnerability in it raw. Charlotte's gaze softened. She turned toward him, her blonde hair catching the city's glow. You're wrong, she whispered. I see the way Lily looks at you. She doesn't need more. She just needs you. Their hands rested side by side on the cold railing, and when their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. It was the lightest of touches, but it carried the weight of something fragile and real. A spark of trust, a fragile thread of connection between two broken hearts, standing high above the city, daring just barely to believe that maybe they weren't as unworthy or as alone as they had thought. Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a billionaire widow, but a woman searching for a home as much as he was. And in that quiet moment on the balcony, with the city lights flickering below, a seed of something new began to take root. For a while, life began to feel almost ordinary again. Charlotte visited often, helping Lily with homework, joining them for dinners in the cramped but warm apartment, and sometimes sitting beside Daniel on the sofa when the little girl drifted off to sleep between them. For Daniel, those evenings felt fragile but real, like pieces of a life he had stopped believing he could have. Then one afternoon, while sorting through paperwork for a small construction business he had been trying to start with a coworker, Daniel came across a thick envelope he hadn't noticed before. Inside were medical invoices from St. Mary's, each stamped in bold red letters, paid in full. The total stared back at him, $70,000. His chest tightened as his eyes raced over each page. Hospital charges, surgical fees, medication, all covered. None by him. He sat frozen at the table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Slowly, anger rose, sharp and hot. He didn't need to guess who had done this. That evening, Daniel showed up at Charlotte's penthouse, the stack of papers clutched in his hand. His boots echoed too loudly against her polished floors as he walked into the living room where she sat with a glass of wine. You paid these. His voice was low, but it shook with restrained fury. He dropped the invoices onto the glass coffee table, the papers scattering like accusations. Charlotte looked up, startled. Daniel, Yes, I did. Lily needed the best care. I had the resources. It was nothing for me. Nothing for you, he repeated, his voice breaking. $70,000. Do you have any idea what that number looks like to me? Do you know what it feels like to find out you've been turning me and my daughter into your charity project? Her eyes widened, wounded. That's not what this is. I wasn't treating you like a project. I care about Lily. I care about you. No, Daniel snapped, pacing across the pristine floor, his fists clenching. You care about how we make you feel. The rich widow swooping in to rescue the poor construction worker and his little girl. It makes you feel needed, doesn't it? It makes you feel like you're fixing something you couldn't fix with David. Charlotte recoiled, her face paling. Don't you dare reduce this to pity. Don't you dare think I'm here out of guilt. Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it. I love being with you. I love being with Lily. That isn't about money. Daniel stopped pacing, his shoulders heaving. He stared at her, pain etched deep into his face. Then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me enough to be honest? Do you know what it feels like to wake up and realize I'm not a father providing for my daughter? I'm just a man being carried by someone else's wallet. Tears filled Charlotte's eyes, but her words came firm. I was protecting you, Daniel. I knew your pride wouldn't let you accept help. I was trying to make life easier for Lily without making you feel the weight of it. It's not about pride, he whispered, his voice raw. It's about trust, and you broke it. The silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Finally, Daniel grabbed his jacket, his boots striking the marble floor like punctuation. I should have known this was too good to be real, he said hoarsely. People like you don't fall for people like me unless there's something in it for you. Charlotte's breath caught, her hands shaking as she reached out, but he was already gone. As the door closed behind him, the sound echoed through the penthouse, leaving her standing alone in a room filled with everything money could buy and absolutely nothing she wanted. The days after their fight were heavy with silence. Daniel tried to throw himself back into work, hammering nails until his hands blistered. But nothing dulled the ache of losing the fragile bond he and Charlotte had begun to build. He came home each evening to Lily's questions. Where's Charlotte? Did she call? And each time his heart clenched a little tighter. He couldn't bring himself to explain why the woman who had become part of their daily life had suddenly disappeared. Then came the letter. It arrived in a thick envelope stamped with legal markings that made Daniel's stomach twist before he even opened it. His eyes scanned the words once, then again, as if reading them differently might change the meaning. Petition for emergency custody filed by Isabella Martinez. For a long moment he sat at the kitchen table, the envelope trembling in his hands. Isabella, the woman who had walked out on them, who had left Lily crying on her bed with nothing but a note, was demanding to take their daughter away. And she wasn't doing it alone. She had hired Rebecca Walsh, one of Chicago's most aggressive family attorneys, a name Daniel had only ever heard in whispered tones about bitter divorces and impossible custody battles. The accusations burned on the page: exploitation of his daughter's medical situation, financial instability, emotional manipulation. Each line painted Daniel not as the devoted father he had been for years, but as a man unfit to raise a child. And worst of all, Walsh had evidence. Evidence Daniel hadn't even known existed until he found those invoices in Charlotte's penthouse. Paid in full, $70,000, proof they claimed that Daniel had used Lily as bait to secure money and favors from a wealthy widow. His chest tightened until he thought he might not breathe again. He imagined a courtroom where strangers would look at him and see only what the papers said: poor, desperate, opportunistic. He imagined Lily being led away by a mother who hadn't stayed sober long enough to raise her. That night, Daniel called Henry Cole, the one lawyer he knew he could trust after everything with Charlotte. His voice cracked as he explained, the words tumbling out with a mix of anger and fear. She's trying to take her from me, Henry. Isabella's saying I'm not fit, that I used my own daughter to get close to Charlotte, that I sold her life for money. Henry's sigh was heavy on the other end of the line. I've seen Walsh work, Daniel. She's ruthless. And with those invoices, she's got leverage. But we'll fight. You've built a life for Lily, neighbors, teachers, everyone knows it. We'll need every voice we can get to testify. Daniel sat at the edge of Lily's bed that night, watching her breathe, her tiny chest rising and falling with the innocence of someone who had no idea her world might soon be ripped apart. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered, I won't let them take you. I swear I won't. But deep down, he knew the truth. With Isabella sober now, with a steady job in San Diego, and with Charlotte gone after their bitter fight, his chances were fragile. The system didn't always care about devotion or love. It cared about paper trails, appearances, stability, and on paper, Isabella looked like a woman reborn, while Daniel looked like a man drowning. As he turned off the lamp and kissed his daughter's cheek, Daniel felt the first real chill of fear seep into his bones. The battle for Lily had begun, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if love alone would be enough to keep her. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and tension. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched. Across the aisle, Isabella looked sharp and polished in a navy suit, her attorney, Rebecca Walsh, standing tall beside her. To the judge in the gallery, she looked like a woman who had rebuilt her life. Steady job, clean record, calm demeanor. Daniel knew appearances could lie, but in court, appearances carried weight. Walsh's opening arguments cut deep. She painted Daniel as a man barely keeping afloat, a father so desperate he had paraded his daughter in front of wealthy strangers. She spoke of unpaid bills, of modest living conditions, of how a child deserves stability, not sacrifice. Her words were knives dressed in silk. Each time she gestured toward him, Daniel felt the sting of being reduced to less than what he was. Henry Cole rose in his defense, calling neighbors and teachers to testify. They spoke of Daniel's devotion, how he left work early for piano lessons, how he never missed a parent-teacher conference, how Lily thrived under his care. Their words were true, heartfelt, but compared to the glossy narrative Walsh spun, they sounded small, almost fragile. Daniel's hope began to fray. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a hush rippled through the room. Charlotte Whitmore stepped inside. She wore a simple black dress, her blonde hair pulled back, her face pale from sleepless nights. For the first time since their fight, Daniel met her eyes. What he saw there was not pity, but resolve. When Henry called her to the stand, the room leaned forward. Charlotte's voice was steady, clear. She told the court about the night in St. Mary's, how she had seen a man fighting desperately for his daughter's life, a man who refused to leave her side. She admitted openly that she had paid Lily's medical bills, not because Daniel asked, but because she could, and because Lily deserved the best care possible. Mr. Alvarez never sought my money, she said firmly. He never once asked for help. The only thing he ever wanted was the chance to care for his daughter. What I gave freely because I cared for them, because I loved them. Walsh rose for cross-examination, circling like a predator. Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that you were grieving your husband's death? That you sought to fill an emotional void by involving yourself with Mr. Alvarez and his child? Charlotte didn't flinch. I was grieving, yes, but Jake and Lily didn't fill a void. They reminded me what family feels like. That is not something you can buy or replace or manipulate. It's love, real love. Her words lingered in the silence that followed, and for the first time, Daniel saw cracks in Walsh's composure. Still, doubt hovered in the air, the balance precarious. Then, unexpectedly, a figure rose from the gallery. An older woman, her voice trembling but strong, addressed the judge. Your Honor, I am Isabella's mother, and I cannot stay silent. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. She went on, her eyes glistening. I love my daughter, but she is not ready to raise Lily. 3 months sober does not erase years of absence. Stability is not a suit you put on for court. I've watched Daniel be the one constant in Lily's life. He is the father she needs, the father she deserves. The words fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the room. Daniel's breath caught, his chest tightening as if hope had returned, fragile, but real. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to believe that the truth might just be strong enough to save his little girl. The courtroom had grown still, the kind of silence that hums with expectation. Judge Morrison shuffled his papers, his expression grave, as though the weight of the decision pressed on him as much as it did on the families before him. Daniel sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white, his heart thudding in his chest. He could feel Lily's small hand resting inside his, trusting, warm. Whatever the verdict, he prayed she would not see the fear he carried. Then Charlotte rose from her seat in the gallery, the sound of her heels against the floor echoing like a bell, commanding attention. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, before you render your decision, I would like to make a statement that may impact this case. The judge arched a brow. This is highly irregular, Mrs. Whitmore. I know, she answered softly, glancing at Daniel before returning her gaze to the bench. But it's necessary. She took a breath, her hands trembling just enough to betray the storm inside her. I am formally petitioning this court for permission to adopt Lily Alvarez as my daughter, with her father's full consent. And furthermore, her voice caught, but she pressed on. Mr. Alvarez and I intend to marry, creating a stable, two-parent household for Lily. The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rebecca Walsh shot to her feet in objection. Isabella's face hardened, and even Henry Cole looked stunned. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as he stared at Charlotte, unable to move, unable to breathe. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, his gavel rapping for order, "this is not the proper venue for personal petitions." But Charlotte raised her chin, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "With respect, Your Honor, this is the most proper place of all, because this case is about what's best for Lily. And I am standing here to say that Lily has already become my daughter in every way that matters. I've fought her as if she were my own. And I love her father, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because together they are my family, and I am willing to put my name, my reputation, my entire life behind that truth." All eyes shifted to Daniel. He rose slowly, his chest heaving, his voice unsteady but clear. "Charlotte, are you sure? After everything, after the mistakes we made?" She turned to him, tears streaming now, unashamed. "I should have fought for us this way from the beginning, not with money, with love, and I will never walk away again." The judge looked at Daniel, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Alvarez, do you consent to this petition?" Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes, Your Honor, with all my heart. Yes, I want this. I want her." Before the gavel could fall, a small voice broke the silence. Lily leapt to her feet, her eyes wide with wonder. "Does this mean Charlotte gets to be my mom? For real?" Her joy rang through the courtroom, bright and unfiltered. Laughter spread across the room, even Judge Morrison's stern expression softening into the faintest smile. He cleared his throat, his tone warmer now. "Well, young lady, there are still legal steps to follow, but I must admit, in 20 years on this bench, I've rarely seen such a compelling declaration of family." Daniel reached for Charlotte's hand, their fingers intertwining as if they had always belonged together. The weight of the trial, the accusations, the fear, all of it seemed to fall away in that instant. What remained was a beginning, not the end of a custody hearing, but the birth of a family. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to hope not just for survival, but for joy. 6 months later, the chapel at St. Mary's was dressed in the simplest of ways. White lilies at the altar, sunlight filtering through stained glass, and a handful of friends and family filling the pews. Daniel stood at the front in a suit borrowed from his best friend at the construction site, his calloused hands fidgeting with the ring tucked in his pocket. When the doors opened, Charlotte walked down the aisle in a plain white dress, no jewels, no grandeur, just grace. At her side, skipping with excitement, was Lily, carrying both rings in a velvet box, as if she'd been entrusted with the secret to their happiness. "You look beautiful," Daniel whispered when Charlotte reached him, his voice catching in his throat. She smiled softly, smoothing his crooked tie. "And you," she whispered back, "clean up better than I expected." The chapel filled with gentle laughter, then quieted as vows were spoken. When they kissed, Lily threw her arms around them both, shouting, "Finally! Now we're officially a family." The words innocent and true left not a single dry eye in the room. The celebration afterward wasn't in a ballroom or a hotel. It was in the modest backyard of the house they had just bought near Lily's school. String lights hung between the old oak trees. Mismatched tables were covered in casseroles brought by neighbors, and the sound of laughter drifted into the night. Daniel's construction crew sat beside Charlotte's foundation board members, an unlikely mix of dusty boots and polished shoes. Yet everyone felt at home. For the first time, Daniel looked around and realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. 2 years passed, and life unfolded in ways he never could have imagined. His small construction company had grown, 3 full-time employees working under his lead. Charlotte, her once lonely penthouse behind her, found more joy in drafting community projects and managing a household alive with chaos. And in the summer light of their backyard, Lily, now 10 years old, sat at the picnic table, sorting screws and nails for the birdhouses Daniel taught neighborhood kids to build. She rolled her eyes at his clumsy explanations. "Dad, you're doing it wrong," she teased, her voice filled with affection. Daniel laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've been building longer than you've been alive, Mika." "Yeah, but I'm smarter," she shot back, flashing him a grin that reminded him so much of her mother and yet so much of her own strength. When Charlotte stepped out of the house, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other carrying lemonade. The teasing stopped only for a moment. She glowed in the late afternoon sun, every bit the picture of peace. "Your husband is being stubborn again," Lily announced, and Charlotte laughed as she lowered herself carefully into a chair. "Then your little sister will have to be as opinionated as you," she replied. Daniel knelt, pressing a kiss to Charlotte's forehead before whispering to her belly, "Hear that, baby girl? Your big sister is already plotting it against me." Lily folded her arms, pretending to be serious. "I'm not abandoning you. I'm going to be a doctor, remember? I'm going to fix people who are broken, just like Mom fixed our family." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and Daniel's throat tightened at the sound of that one word. Mom, spoken with such casual certainty. 2 years earlier, it had been a fragile hope. Now it was simply true. As the sun dipped behind the houses, the backyard rang with the sounds of children playing, neighbors talking, and the chaos of a home built on love. Daniel looked around, his arm around Charlotte, his daughter's laughter filling the air, and knew this was everything he had never dared to dream. Family, he realized, isn't always about blood. Sometimes it is chosen, built day by day with forgiveness, patience, and the courage to trust again. And in the glow of string lights and laughter, he understood at last. This was the life he had been building toward all along. In the sterile glow of St. Mary's emergency room, Daniel Alvarez sat broken, his daughter's life hanging by a thread, trapped by legal red tape and the weight of his own helplessness. Charlotte Whitmore, a billionaire widow carrying her own scars of loss, saw not a struggling construction worker, but a father fighting for his child. Her simple words, "You're not alone anymore," and her relentless action to secure Lily's surgery bridged their worlds of pain. Their journey from a tense hospital night to a courtroom declaration of love and family teaches us a profound lesson. True connection is born in shared vulnerability, not status or wealth. Daniel's devotion to Lily and Charlotte's courage to step into their lives show that family is built through choice, trust, and forgiveness, not just blood. When Charlotte paid Lily's medical bills, it sparked conflict, but her honest love in the courtroom, vowing to adopt Lily and marry Daniel, proved that authenticity heals deeper than money ever could. This story reminds us that in our darkest moments, reaching out or accepting help can forge unbreakable bonds. It's a call to see beyond appearances, to offer kindness without agenda, and to embrace second chances, knowing that love can rebuild what loss has shattered. Their family, sealed in a sunlit backyard with Lily's laughter, shows that hope blooms where trust is sown. If this story moved you, share in the comments. What does family mean to you, or has a stranger's kindness ever changed your life? Tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe in the power of chosen bonds. For more stories of love, courage, and hope, hit subscribe now, join our community, and keep these heartfelt tales alive, one moment at a time.